Happy almost Halloween, everybody. I wanted to talk today about the history of the pointy hat, brewsters, and alewives. But first I wanted to talk about women in fermentation. By almost every archaeological account, it is assumed that women, in fact, were the ones that not only discovered fermentation, but as we start to gather archaeological evidence, all signs point to the fact that women across cultures really were the caretakers of fermentation, beer, ale, and wine throughout history. And imagine you're the first person to stumble across fermentation, how magical and mystical this must have seemed. So it makes sense that fermentations were often used for spiritual or ceremonial purposes. In fact, in ancient Sumeria, predating Dionysus and Baucis, you've got Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, thought to have given beer to mankind to bring happiness and peace, which is kind of cool. But what can seem magical can also seem dangerous. So you can even see, prior to Europe in the Middle Ages, we can begin to piece together that this was not always so great for how women were perceived. I mean, if you look in the Odyssey, you know, Homer's The Odyssey, you have Circe, who, you know, got people drunk and turned them into swine. If you look at Lady Macbeth, which, yes, Shakespeare didn't write that until Elizabeth was sitting on the throne, but that story actually existed previously for centuries and was passed down. The story of Macbeth. And what do you have? You have Lady Macbeth getting Duncan's servants, wine and wassail, drunk before killing Duncan, right? So there are all of these sort of instances of a woman trying to gain power through the use of fermented beverages. So it makes sense as beer became more important, particularly let's look at Europe right now and let's look at England. As beer became more and more important and as it became more profitable, women brewsters were seen with more and more suspicion, and in fact people loved to hate on them. They just loved to hate on them. So by the 1300s, beer was becoming significantly more important, particularly within Europe. You have things like the bubonic plague, where beer was safer to drink than water, but it was going a little bit out of, you know, just women selling out of their house from household to household, this, you know, brew that they made, to a bit more of a trade. And, you know, by the time you get to the 1500s, this is a business, you know, this is a full business. In fact, women entrepreneurs thought, early marketing technique, they thought maybe if they wore pointy hats in crowds, people would know where to get the beer. They would know where to get the brew from. And then on their shops, they put brooms over the door, which is similar to like a barber shop having a, you know, little striped guy in the front, right? You know, so everybody knew, hey, the beer is ready. The beer is here. And then by that broom, there was a star, and each of the points of the star was a point of quality of the beer, you know, the water, you know, or the grain, and the brewster herself, right? They all signified a certain amount of quality. And if you were to go in that store, that little shop, you would see a cauldron with which they brewed their magical mash to make the beer. And then you would also see cats. You would see cats because they were protecting all of the grains, you know, from vermin. So you're starting to see, right, the imagery that's going on here. But you're also seeing in the 1500s a major movement towards hardcore religious view of the world, where women, any way they might have not been in a traditional role, there was a movement to put them back. And, you know, as these women had started to have a little bit of autonomy, right, a little bit of power, the whole, you know, religious movement from the pulpit was to like put women back in the kitchen. Not that they were ever really leaving at that point, right? I mean, this is not women's rights central 1500s in London, but You know, people really did love to hate on these women as well. The same bargaining techniques that some of these women implemented to just, you know, make a living, just to get by, were really, really demonized. And when men took over, and they took over by starting guilds, like beer guilds, and not allowing women in, men were not demonized in the same fashion. And so you started to see, and there's a lot of like imagery around this, if you really look it up, and there's a couple of books I'll recommend in the comments. You really start to see images of women as being like wicked, with these hats around this time, as this sort of, you know, crafty, you know, evil creature. And then you literally have the beginning of the witch hunts, which, you know, again, we don't have a time machine. We can't go back to be certain, but all signs point to the fact that these women were singled out as, you know, independent entrepreneurial women, as targets for this witch hunt. And that is effectively how men took over the brew industry, and it's never really gone back. It's still a very, very male dominated industry. Although there are more and more women, of course, brewsters, which is kind of amazing. And then I just wanted to say, you know, about, you know, alcohol, which is such like a lengthy and rich and crazy history that goes on so many twists and turns. You know, we don't know when the first person in fermentation decided to put like flowers and herbs. You know, we have different, you know, archaeological tidbits that are going back, but I love that this sort of not only is fermentation something that stumbles out throughout our human history, but this tradition of women as the caretaker of plants, and how these two things really have such an integral relationship with one another. And these women as the caretaker of plants, you know, made a lot of different types of aromatics and ferments. So, you know, flower wine is a huge part of fermentation history, but so is fruit wine. You know, it wasn't always grape wine. People made ferments from what grew around them. So even before the year 1200, there is a history of alcoholic ferments being used to extract aromatic ingredients. And I think there are just so many ways that this history of fermentation and perfume are so entwined, particularly as women being the caretaker of plants. You know, so often the idea of perfume, we're thinking of some designer spray fragrance, but perfume has meant so many more things, from a religious to a spiritual to a plant medicine, and an energy medicine viewpoint throughout history. But I could go on that subject forever. But for this weekend, when you see a woman wearing a pointy hat, while it may evoke feelings of thinking about Wicca or witchcraft, perhaps think of those brewsters, those women fighting for some autonomy in a man's world, and kind of how badass that is. Anyway, have a great Halloween, everybody.